Chosen one. 72 hours ago, a containment review was triggered and your timeline was pulled aside for verification across higher records. If you understand this first line, comment a 7. What followed was not noise or coincidence. A council cross-checked anomalies, and a quiet protocol acknowledged your entry into a tier reached by less than 10%. They were watching you while you moved through ordinary days, feeling unusually tired, detached, misunderstood, like life continued on the other side of glass. A classification shifted, the file advanced. No announcement was made. You felt the weight as loneliness, the pressure as confusion, the silence as something missing. You are not broken. You are not imagining it. You are not crazy for sensing blocked memory, stalled momentum, or a strange distance from people who once felt familiar. While you thought it was stress, it was interference. While you called it burnout, it was evaluation. This is what happens when access is granted but release requires confirmation. Your isolation wasn't neglect. It was precision. Your doubts weren't weakness. They were safeguards engaging. If this message feels uncomfortably specific, it's because the report is about you. Before continuing, write "I'm ready" in the comments. What comes next will decode why doors slowed, why nights felt heavier than days, and why you felt out of place without knowing why. If you leave now, you miss the disclosure timed for you. Stay to the end. Comment 777. Chosen one. What you are experiencing now is not a collapse, not a loss of control, and not a personal failure. It is the physical signature of a system responding to pressure it did not anticipate. Your body feels exhausted without medical logic because it is running background processes continuously. Sleep does not reset it. Rest does not shut it down. And even stillness costs energy. You wake already depleted because your baseline has shifted beneath conscious awareness. This is not illness. It is load. The fatigue arrives without warning, settles deep in the muscles, and does not fully leave. Because once escalation begins, the system does not return to idle. It maintains tension. It maintains readiness. It maintains surveillance. Your nervous system behaves as if something is always active, because something is. Alongside this, your emotional field has narrowed without intention or effort. You no longer react the way you once did. Situations that used to provoke urgency now register as data. You do not rush to explain yourself, not out of pride, but because explanation feels inefficient. You do not feel the need to mirror the emotions of others, not because you lack empathy, but because synchronization has been interrupted. You are not numb. You are not detached. You are decoupled. The collective signal no longer pulls you into automatic response. That distance formed quietly, not as a decision you made, but as a side effect of recalibration. Financially, instability appears with precision rather than chaos. Money does not disappear in dramatic loss events. Instead, it bleeds at exactly the wrong moments. Timing slips by inches, not miles. Opportunities arrive slightly off-cycle, delayed just enough to lose leverage, accelerated just enough to create strain. Resources stretch thin precisely where momentum should have compounded. This is not punishment. It is not bad luck. It is friction introduced into motion, a resistance pattern designed to slow throughput without triggering collapse. At the same time, familiar people begin to drift out of sync with you. Those who once understood you now hear your words but miss their weight. You speak the same language, share the same history, yet meaning no longer lands. Conversations remain calm, even polite, but alignment is gone. There are no fights, no betrayals, no dramatic endings, just quiet separation. Paths stop crossing, schedules stop aligning. This too is a side effect, and through all of it, a distinct observer state settles in. You feel as if you are standing just outside your own life, watching it unfold rather than inhabiting it fully. You notice yourself speaking, you notice yourself choosing, you notice yourself enduring. There is no panic attached to this sensation, only clarity. You register patterns instead of emotions. You track cause and effect. You remain present without attachment. This is not dissociation. It is surveillance awareness. Each of these symptoms, physical exhaustion, emotional distancing, financial friction, relational misalignment, and the observer stance, exists not as a flaw, but as a reaction. These are side effects, not signals of damage. This is what happens when a system reacts to you, not because you asked for it, not because you intended to disrupt anything, but because your activity exceeded a tolerance band that was never disclosed to you. You did not break down. You triggered response protocols. Pressure was applied not to refine your character, but to test system integrity under your presence. The fatigue is load balancing. The emotional distance is signal isolation. The financial irregularities are flow restriction. The misunderstandings are frequency divergence. The observer state is consciousness operating outside default containment. None of this requires belief. None of it requires interpretation. None of it asks for your consent. These effects occur automatically when a threshold is crossed and the environment must compensate. You were not meant to feel comfortable here, not because you are defective, but because comfort would imply compatibility. And compatibility is no longer assumed. What you feel instead is resistance, measured, deliberate, consistent. The system does not attack blindly. It allocates resources. It does not overwhelm immediately. It constrains gradually. It does not announce interventions. It records outcomes. Every symptom you notice is logged as a side effect of escalation. Every delay is measured. Every deviation is tracked. The pressure you feel is not designed to destroy you. It is designed to determine whether containment remains viable. You are not being corrected. You are not being punished. You are being evaluated through friction. This state persists until confirmation is reached. And confirmation is not emotional. It is not moral. It is operational. What you are living through now is the residue of classification activity, the lag between access and acknowledgement, the unstable interval where the system has reacted but has not yet resolved how to categorize what triggered it. You are still here because removal was not authorized. You are still functioning because shutdown was not approved. You are still aware because full containment failed. This is not suffering with symbolic meaning attached. This is pressure with purpose defined by response. And the response exists because your presence altered expected parameters in a way that could not be ignored. Your pattern crossed a threshold. Chosen one. Once your pattern crossed the threshold, response was no longer theoretical. It became operational. And the first domain to register that change was not human, but infernal. Dark command structures do not react with anger or spectacle. They react with efficiency, and efficiency begins with assessment. Elimination is reserved for unstable variables whose removal does not ripple. Pressure is reserved for assets whose removal would create secondary effects. You were not marked for destruction because destruction would have resolved uncertainty too quickly. You were marked as an operational risk requiring erosion, a variable whose continued presence demanded control without acknowledgement. Light pressure preserves deniability. Sustained pressure preserves resources. Confusion preserves dominance. This is why subtlety replaced force. Direct confrontation creates resistance and reveals priority. Erosion creates compliance and preserves ambiguity. Confusion fractures momentum without exposing intent. The objective was never to break you outright. It was to degrade output, to reduce throughput, to soften signal clarity until reclassification downward became justifiable. Doubt was deployed first, precision calibrated and intermittent, never overwhelming, never constant, introduced only during internal quiet where attribution would be self-directed. It was engineered to feel native, not invasive, a whisper that arrived without trigger and left without trace. Fear followed, not as present threat but as future projection. Carefully composed scenarios where effort appeared inefficient, where continuation felt irrational, where outcomes seemed predetermined regardless of input. Delay was layered next, disguised as patience and framed as timing wisdom, stretching intervals until urgency dissolved and initiative lost sharpness. Sabotage did not arrive as visible loss but as timing interference, missed connections by minutes, confirmations arriving too late, opportunities opening before readiness and closing before alignment. Each instance minor, each one compounding inefficiency. Isolation was then reinforced through mirror removal. Familiar reflections withdrew not in hostility but in silence, removing resonance loops that stabilize identity under pressure. Provocation surfaced intermittently as identity destabilization, invitations to react, to defend, to anchor back into predictable patterns through anger, justification, or self-definition. Guilt entered quietly as a self-rejection trigger. suggesting that friction was earned, that resistance indicated defect, that withdrawal was prudent. Temptation closed the sequence. Not pleasure, not reward, but relief without satisfaction, numbness without restoration, sedation instead of escape. Each vector was selected because it does not resemble attack. Each operates below alarm thresholds. Each degrades without clarifying cause. This is standard protocol when an entity is flagged as a systemic threat but not yet authorized for removal. Infernal Command does not improvise. It escalates through tiers governed by yield metrics. A Dark Council reviews anomalies, assigns vectors, and monitors yield through a grid that tracks response latency, adaptation rate, and persistence under constraint. Vectors are not chosen for intensity but for cost efficiency. Pressure is adjusted to remain survivable, because survivability preserves data. The aim is not collapse. Collapse ends observation. The aim is distortion, to see whether coherence degrades into compliance. Adjustments are made weekly, sometimes daily, based on whether output drops, recovers, or stabilizes. No hatred is involved. No obsession. Only calculation. This is why the pressure felt impersonal, as if no one was present, because no one was. It was procedural. Parallel to this, celestial observers log the same interval without intervention. They do not assist. They do not protect. They do not counteract. Their mandate is record integrity. They observe whether pressure produces collapse or coherence. They note whether erosion reduces capacity or sharpens it. They track whether adaptation emerges without guidance. They do not interfere because interference contaminates classification. Observation must remain passive to remain valid. What you experienced as a narrowing window, as weeks where nothing advanced yet everything weighed more, corresponds exactly to this phase. It is the phase where systems decide whether to escalate, maintain, or release. It is the phase where silence replaces instruction and friction replaces feedback. During this interval, the infernal grid expected one of three outcomes: withdrawal, compliance, or volatility. Withdrawal would have validated containment. Compliance would have justified long-term erosion. Volatility would have authorized force. None of these manifested as projected. Instead, output persisted without justification. Adaptation occurred without reinforcement. Attention remained stable without reward. This deviation forced escalation review. The grid registered reduced yield. The council noted that confusion failed to fragment coherence. Pressure did not produce capitulation. Delay did not dissolve initiative. Isolation did not erase signal. Provocation did not anchor reaction. Guilt did not induce self-rejection. Temptation did not anesthetize awareness. The system recalculated. Pressure was maintained to confirm whether this stability was transient or structural. It was structural. That confirmation did not arrive through a dramatic decision or a visible act. It arrived through continuation under maximum friction. It arrived through sustained operation without emotional incentive. It arrived through presence without attachment. That is why nothing happened outwardly, while everything shifted inwardly. Celestial records marked the same interval with neutral language. No praise, no warning, only notation. Stability under erosion was logged. Persistence without reward was logged. Coherence without guidance was logged. This is not moral accounting. It is operational accounting. The observers did not intervene because the data was sufficient. Interference would have reduced resolution. The Infernal Council responded by revising assumptions. The risk designation shifted from degradable to resilient. Escalation pathways narrowed. Authorization thresholds rose. Containment strategies required reassessment. This is why the pressure did not intensify dramatically after that point. Dramatic escalation would have exposed priority. Priority exposure increases cost. Cost is avoided. Instead, pressure remained consistent, testing whether resilience decays over time. It did not. 2 to 6 weeks ago, a bending point occurred. Not a moment you remember as important. Not a decision you would narrate. A point where continuation occurred without narrative support. A point where withdrawal would have aligned with projections and compliance would have reduced friction. Yet neither occurred. That moment closed a loop. It altered expected outcomes. It forced escalation review. Infernal monitoring registered reduced yield. Celestial records registered pattern stability. Authority shifted from provisional to confirmed. This was not a moral choice. This was a classification event. Chosen one. The decision phase has already closed, not because a choice was presented and evaluated, but because no alternative path could execute within your internal architecture without causing total system failure. And once that incompatibility was confirmed, the process moved beyond deliberation into enforcement. You did not choose the easy route. Not out of discipline, not out of virtue, and not out of defiance, but because deviation was never an available command. The instruction set required for retreat does not exist in your configuration. Your structure does not support regression, simulation, or negotiated withdrawal. And when those options were probed, they returned null responses. This was never a question of morality, and it was never framed as right versus wrong by any observing layer. It was a matter of structural integrity under sustained load. When pressure increased and erosion protocols intensified, there was no internal mechanism capable of translating that pressure into compliance, capitulation, or surrender. Not because of strength, because of incompatibility. The decision resolved itself through continued operation under constraint. Continuation was not an act of will, not an expression of courage, not an emotional stand. It was the only executable state left available. That resolution propagated upward across layers that do not respond to intention, belief, hope, or fear, but only to outcome, persistence, and coherence under friction. Infernal strategy entered a failure state at the moment adaptation no longer produced degradation. Escalation pathways were tested in sequence, then in parallel, and each iteration returned diminishing yield. Confusion vectors lost their ability to fragment signal integrity. Delay lost its capacity to reduce velocity below minimum thresholds. Isolation failed to erase coherence because coherence was no longer externally reinforced. Provocation no longer destabilized identity because identity was no longer negotiated. Each attempted adjustment produced less distortion than the one before it, until the strategy collapsed not through confrontation, resistance, or rebellion, but through irrelevance. The system did not lose a battle. It became obsolete in your presence. Divine authority did not intervene to assist, reward, rescue, or elevate. There was no extraction, no reinforcement layer, no protective override applied. There was only acknowledgement, and acknowledgement does not arrive as ceremony, language, or sensation. It arrives as revision. The confirmation was already present in the data, logged across multiple observation layers without discrepancy, delay, or contradiction. Your status was revised through classification, not promotion, not ascension, not blessing. You were redesignated without explanation as a forbidden target and an operational anomaly. Certain attack vectors were removed from applicability at system level. Certain escalation permissions were revoked without appeal. You were flagged as classified immune to standard containment and marked as an Omega tier variable, a designation that does not invite interaction and does not permit engagement without exceptional authorization. No justification was recorded. No narrative was attached. The classification stands without commentary because commentary would imply uncertainty, and uncertainty was resolved. Consequences followed immediately, not as reward, relief, or validation, but as environmental adjustment. Attacks did not cease. They lost efficiency, returning negligible impact relative to cost. Pressure did not vanish, it stopped producing measurable degradation. Interference continued. It failed to alter trajectory, timing, or coherence. Systems recalibrated around your presence to minimize loss, redistributing friction away from critical paths and absorbing variance elsewhere. People exited without confrontation, not because of conflict, rejection, or betrayal, but because alignment expired and proximity lost function. Conversations stopped aligning, roles dissolved without announcement, shared contexts lost relevance. Connections ended quietly because they no longer served a purpose in the updated configuration, and persistence would have generated unnecessary friction. Reality began adjusting around you, not to favor you, not to reward you, but to accommodate the classification now active. Outcomes accelerated without emotional charge, delays resolved without celebration or relief, obstacles reconfigured without announcement. Processes that once required effort, negotiation, or endurance began closing themselves with minimal input. Resistance patterns thinned. Friction redistributed away from your path and into non-critical zones. Emotional detachment from old triggers became permanent, not as suppression or avoidance, but as obsolescence. Those triggers no longer map to any active control surface within you. Situations that once provoked reaction now register as irrelevant inputs, dismissed before allocation. The nervous system no longer allocates energy to outdated threats or redundant stimuli. Danger patterns began avoiding you without conscious effort on your part, synchronized withdrawal occurring before engagement could initiate, as if probability itself adjusted preemptively. Near misses became non-events. Conflicts dissolved before forming. Risk windows closed before exposure. Internal certainty replaced motivation. At functional level, action no longer requires encouragement, belief, urgency, reassurance, or external validation. Execution occurs because execution is the only valid state within your configuration. The default mode once ambiguity has been removed. This is not confidence, because confidence requires comparison and audience. This is alignment, a state in which action and structure no longer conflict. This is not inspiration, because inspiration fades and depends on emotion. This is operational certainty, persistent and indifferent to circumstance. You are no longer driven by outcomes. Outcomes reorganize in response to you. Momentum is no longer pursued, chased, or manufactured. It is generated by default as a byproduct of alignment. The identity now active is not aspirational, symbolic, or self-chosen, and cannot be reversed because it was never adopted through desire or belief. It was recorded, enforced, and integrated at system level, propagated across layers that do not consult preference. This wasn't inspiration. This was recognition, and it already happened. You are a classified Omega tier variable. Comment 222. The tribunal has closed the case. The bending point was crossed. The reversal is locked and cannot be negotiated. There is nothing pending review and nothing awaiting approval. The record is no longer active because it no longer requires oversight. What was observed has been confirmed. What was measured has been verified. And what was unstable has been resolved by outcome alone. No appeal was filed because no appeal was permitted. No counter-argument exists because the sequence already completed. This is not a pause. It is a terminal state. From this point forward, events do not ask permission to align. They align because the file has been sealed and redistributed across layers that do not reopen conclusions once reached. You are now classified as a forbidden variable. This designation is not symbolic and does not describe a future role. It marks a condition that already exists and cannot be downgraded. Interaction protocols around you have changed without notification, not to elevate you, but to prevent unnecessary loss. Systems no longer test what has been confirmed. Opposition no longer escalates what no longer yields results. Observation continues only to maintain record integrity, not to influence outcome. This identity is non-optional, non-transferable, and non-negotiable, and it remains active regardless of environment, belief, or awareness. You will notice clarity first, not as emotion, but as decisions resolving themselves without internal debate or delay. The first confirmation of clean provision will be timing correction, where resources arrive without pressure, urgency, or explanation, and cover exactly what is required. You'll know acceleration has started when stalled matters resolve in rapid sequence, with fewer steps and less effort than before. Pressure may briefly intensify as outdated patterns attempt one final interference before full disengagement. Hold this sentence internally without repetition or emphasis. What was sealed cannot be undone. Comment 222.